Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. So, a little over a year ago now, as one of the first videos I did on this channel after I started taking YouTube seriously, I made a video ranking my top 10 Railway series books. It was one of my favourite to make, and is one of my more successful videos. I'd been meaning to do a full ranking of all 42 Railway series books for a while, and the Thomas Cynic releasing his video prompted me to finally do it. I am a lot more familiar with Wilbert's books than Christopher's, as I think most people are, but for this video I went back and read them, and by read I mean watch fan remakes of them on YouTube, as I don't actually have Chris's books. Starting at number 42, Thomas and Victoria by Christopher Awdry, with the stories Overloaded, Avalanche, Eels on Wheels, and Toby's Vintage Train. The penultimate book in the series. I don't think this book is bad, I don't think any of them are, but it definitely doesn't live up to the standard of the others. Something that's going to be heard quite a bit in this video is what's better, a book with 4 good stories making a great book, or a book with 4 great stories making an average book, whereas this just has 4 okay stories making an average book. The book is titled Thomas and Victoria, and Eels on Wheels doesn't feature either of them. Overloaded should have been split into 2 stories, one about the workmen and them needing a new coach, and one about them finding Victoria, and then remove Eels on Wheels. Also, I know this wasn't Chris's fault, but remove Thomas's name from the title. This book is barely about him. I know this is something the publishers made him do, but the title would make so much more sense as Toby and Victoria, or even just Victoria the coach. Not a bad book, but a bit boring and definitely the worst. My least favourite story is Eels on Wheels, and my favourite is Avalanche. At number 41, I have Thomas and His Friends by Christopher Awdry, with the stories Thomas and the Swan, Buffer Bashing, Gordon's Fire Service, and Centenary. The final book of the franchise is definitely a step up from Thomas and Victoria. A little boring, and you can tell they were really scraping the bottom for ideas, but it's still a good book. The final story may have been a bit underwhelming, with all that really happens is Henry's tunnel collapsing, but I don't have many complaints, other than it's not as good as the others. My least favourite story is probably Thomas and the Swan, and my favourite is Gordon's Fire Service. Number 40, Branch Line Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Thomas Comes to Breakfast, Daisy, Bullseyes, and Percy's Predicament. I don't know what the general fan consensus is on this book, but I imagine it's rated quite highly. I've spoken a couple of times before on why I dislike Thomas Comes to Breakfast, and that also applies to the Railway series story as well as the TV episode. And I just don't like Daisy's character early on. I'm not saying she's a bad character, because she's not. She's one of the series' strongest, but I just don't particularly like her, so that takes out the rest of the book. This is one of those very subjective opinions. It is by no means a bad book, I just don't really like it all that much. My least favourite story is Thomas Comes to Breakfast, and my favourite is Bullseyes. Number 39, Great Little Engines by Christopher, with the stories Patience is a Virtue, Peter Sam and the Prickly Problem, Pop Special, and The Handle Comes Home. This is one of the 5 books I remembered from my first reading/viewing of Chris's books, and I remember liking it a lot, thinking it was one of his better ones. Upon revisiting it, however, it doesn't hold up as well as I remember, and Chris's other books have done better than I remembered. I've seen people say that Pop Special is the worst Railway series story overall, and I can't think why. It's not the greatest story ever or anything like that, but it's definitely not the worst. While I like Pop Special, the other 3 are quite average. I'd say my least favourite is The Handle Comes Home, and my favourite is Pop Special. Number 38, James the Red Engine by Wilbert, with the stories James in the Top Hat, James in the Bootlace, Troublesome Trucks, and James in the Express. Wilbert said this was his least favourite book, as it had to be rushed to meet a deadline, and that shows. This is essentially a 2-story book. James in the Top Hat is just a filler episode, which was combined with James in the Bootlace for TV, which I think works better, and James in the Express is a bonus story tagged on at the end of James's arc, to make up the 4 stories. It's not a bad book, it's just a bit boring. My least favourite story is James in the Top Hat, and my favourite is Troublesome Trucks. Number 37, James and the Diesel Engines by Christopher, with the stories Old Stuck Up, Cross Lines, Fire Engine, and Deep Freeze. This is the first time when the argument of 4 okay stories making a great book versus 4 great stories making an okay book comes up. I like all 4 stories. The first one might be a little boring, but they're all still good. But when you throw them together, they don't make a great book. The book is called James and the Diesel Engines, and is about James overcoming his prejudice towards diesels, only for the second story to have nothing about diesels, and the third to be about Henry. Not every story in a book has to be about the main character, but it still has to be useful to the overall arc or include a title character in a prominent way. Thomas in Trouble is about Thomas, but it explains why Toby comes to Sodor. Gordon's Whistle is about Gordon, but features Henry prominently. James is basically non-existent in Fire Engine. It's a good story, I think all 4 are, but it doesn't really belong in this book. And then the final story, the story that concludes James's character arc and convinces him that diesels aren't all bad, has one diesel who isn't even named and doesn't even speak, save James. Why wasn't this Bear? It says at the start of the book that Boko was the only diesel that James likes. Well, he works with Bear on the main line, why not have him prove his worth to James? This book is 4 good stories, but they form a very average book. I'd say my least favourite is Fire Engine, and my favourite is Deep Freeze. Number 36, New Little Engine by Christopher, with the stories Speed Killer, Sir Handel's Plan, Dirty Water, and My Nameless Engine. Quite an average book. None of the stories are bad, but none are great. Dirty Water I think is quite a good story in how it shows how celebrities are treated. Peter Sam is clearly unwell but is still forced to sit there because people want to see him. But Dirty Water is still probably my least favourite story, and my favourite is Speed Killer. Number 35, Very Old Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Crosspatch, Bucking Bronco, Stick in the Mud, and Ducks and Dukes. Like Branch Line Engines, I don't think this book is by any means one of the worst. It's just not one that I particularly like very much. While all 4 stories are good, the first 3 showing Scarlowe and Rhaeus' early days on Sodor, I dislike it because of the way Scarlowe and Rhaeus act in their younger days. This isn't a criticism, as it works well, just on a personal level I don't particularly like it. My least favourite story is Stick in the Mud, and my favourite is Bucking Bronco. Number 34, Thomas Comes Home by Christopher, with the stories No Problem, Wash Out, Toby's Mega Train, and Thomas Comes Home. Another book by Chris with 4 good stories, but not forming a great book, with only the last one being about the book's title. I'd say my least favourite is Thomas Comes Home, and my favourite is Wash Out. Number 33, Thomas and the Twins by Christopher, with the stories Scrambled Eggs, What a Picture, Trevor Helps Out, and Down the Drain. Another 4 decent stories, and this book does at least have a solid overarching plot. It brings back Trevor, so that's nice. Overall, I'd say my least favourite is What a Picture, and my favourite is Trevor Helps Out. Number 32, Tramvay Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Ghost Train, Woolly Bear, Mavis, and Toby's Tightrope. Again, this is a very subjective opinion. This is definitely not a bad book. It's just here because I don't like it when the engines that are supposedly friends are just at each other's throats all the time for no reason whatsoever, like Thomas and Percy in the first 2 stories and Toby and Mavis in the second half. That being said, I would be lying if I said I didn't enjoy Ghost Train, and Toby's Tightrope is a truly fantastic story. My least favourite is Woolly Bear, and my favourite is Toby's Tightrope. Number 31, Thomas the Tank Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Thomas and Gordon, Thomas's Train, Thomas and the Trucks, and Thomas and the Breakdown Train. Again, not a bad book, and includes some of the most classic Thomas stories of all time, but it does get a tad boring. Overall, my least favourite is Thomas and the Trucks, and my favourite is Thomas and Gordon. Number 30, Tank Engine Thomas again by Wilbert, with the stories Thomas and the Guard, Thomas Goes Fishing, Thomas Terrence in the Snow, and Thomas and Bertie. Similar to Thomas the Tank Engine, it's not bad, featuring extremely well-known classic as can be stories, but a little boring. This is especially true for my least favourite story, Thomas and the Guard. My favourite is Thomas and Bertie. Number 29, more about Thomas the Tank Engine by Christopher, with the stories Thomas, Percy and Nicole, The Runaway, Better Late Than Never, and Drip Tank. That's right, my favourite of the 3 main Thomas books is a Christopher one, shoot me. I actually think this is a really good book. A lot of people say Better Late Than Never is terrible, but I personally think it's very underrated. It's not the best story by any means, but it's definitely not one of the worst, for reasons I will go into more in a later video. Overall, I'd say my least favourite is Drip Tank, and my favourite is The Runaway. Number 28, The Twin Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Hello Twins, The Missing Coach, Brake Van, and A Deputation. This book is weighed down by having one confusing and one nothing story. Hello Twins is just there to introduce Donald and Douglas, and while it does that well, that's pretty much all it does, and The Missing Coach is just confusing. I don't know what the general feeling around the fandom is, so I don't know whether this is a hot take or not, but I don't blame Britt Allcroft for cancelling this episode. I still don't understand why they swapped tenders, so either I'm dumb or it is genuinely a very confusing story. The second half of the book is very strong, but not good enough to put it up above this point. My least favourite is The Missing Coach, and my favourite is Brake Van. Number 27, Toby Trucks and Trouble by Christopher, with the stories Mavis and the Lorry, Toby Seaside Holiday, Bulstrode, and Toby Takes the Road. I'm not the biggest fan of the episode's special attraction, but the two stories they're based on are both stronger in this book, and the other two stories are both great as well. I'd say my least favourite is Toby Seaside Holiday, and my favourite is Mavis and the Lorry. Number 27, Thomas and the Fat Controller's Engines by Christopher, with the stories Bird Strike, Edward and the Cabbages, Rabbits, and Golden Jubilee. I'm always a massive fan of when Edward is the main character of a good story, with him being completely in character. I also love how the three stories in the book about the 50th anniversary of the Railway series focus on Gordon and Edward, the first two characters introduced, and Thomas, the main. There's the main character, the most important character, and the most loved character. It would have been even better if the third story had been about Henry instead of Thomas, but there's only so much they could do with the likely demands the publishers were making, and Henry does at least have a fairly prominent role in the final story, although he isn't the main character by any means. I'd say my least favourite is Rabbits, and my favourite is Edward and the Cabbages. Number 25, Thomas and the Great Railway Show by Christopher, with the stories Museum Piece, Not the Ticket, Trouble on the Line, and Thomas and the Rail Tour. I really like this book. Definitely not the best, but I think it's nice. While I would criticise Thomas being the one to go if this universe was fully contained within itself, the Railway series and the TV show being fully confirmed to exist in this universe means that it would make sense for Thomas to go as the main character and the face of the franchise. My least favourite story is Not the Ticket, and my favourite is Thomas and the Rail Tour. Number 24, The Little Old Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Trucks, Home at Last, Rock and Roll, and Little Old Engine. This book has 3 good stories, and that's my biggest problem. While all 4 stories are good, Home at Last and Rock and Roll are both exactly the same. There's basically nothing different about them, so while every story is good, there are only 3 good stories. My least favourite is Home at Last as the inferior version of Rock and Roll, and my favourite is Trucks. Number 23, Duck and the Diesel Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Domeless Engines, Pop Goes to Diesel, Dirty Work, and A Close Shave. This book is the very definition of 4 great stories forming an average book. A Close Shave is an awesome story, but doesn't work well as the final part. The Fat Controller says he never believed Diesel. Okay, so why send Duck away in the first place? Why play into Diesel's plan and make the engines hate Duck? This book would be so much better if you add on another story at the end. Say James saw Duck's heroic act, which brought him round to Duck's side, and the final story is convincing Henry and Gordon. You can even have the Fat Controller believing Duck all along, and he sent him away to get the other engines to learn themselves that Diesel's lying, rather than just bringing him back immediately. Get rid of Domeless Engines, you don't need it. It's a good story, but it's taking up a slot in this book where it's not needed. Or do a Henry the Green Engine and have a 5th story. That book had a 5th story for Percy and the Trousers, which barely had Henry in and could easily be taken out, and a 5th story wasn't used here when it would be beneficial. The stories are all great, but they don't fit very well together into a great book. My least favourite story is Dirty Work, and my favourite is A Close Shave. Number 22, Toby the Tram Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Toby and the Stout Gentleman, Thomas in Trouble, Dirty Objects, and Mrs. Grundy's Christmas. One thing this book does really well is show exactly why Toby is needed. Other than other engines where it's just another engine is needed, this one shows why a tram engine specifically is needed. Overall, I'd say my least favourite is Thomas in Trouble, and my favourite is Dirty Objects. Number 21. Jock the New Engine by Christopher, with the stories We Need Another Engine, Sticking Power, Jock, and Teamwork. I think the first half of this book is a lot better than the second. The first two stories being great, but then the third is a bit of a nothing story, and the fourth isn't that good. The main problem with this book is the massive jumps in the timeline. But if you just read the book, you'd have absolutely no idea that the time jump exists. That could be used as either criticism or justification, but it doesn't take away from the enjoyment of the book. My least favourite story is Jock, and my favourite is Sticking Power. Number 20. Gallant Old Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Special Funnel, Steamroller, Passengers and Polish, and Gallant Old Engine. 4 more great stories about the narrow gauge engines, with the last one being the standout. The main problem is that Edward's Exploit, Old Faithful, and Gallant Old Engine are all basically the same story, and Gallant Old Engine is probably the least good of the 3, but it's still amazing. And the other 3 are good as well, with my least favourite being Passengers and Polish, and my favourite being Gallant Old Engine. Number 19. Wilbert's The Forest Engine by Christopher, with the stories Percy's Porridge, Cab Over Wheels, Foaming at the Funnel, and Wired Up. We're into the top 4 Christopher books now. All of these stories are great. I'd say my least favourite is Wired Up, as it's just a less good version of Sticking Power, and my favourite is Cab Over Wheels. Number 18. 4 Little Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Scarlo Remembers, Sir Handel, Peter Salmon the Refreshment Lady, and Old Faithful. Another great book. Scarlo Remembers introduces the Scarlo Railway really well, using Edward's point of view, a character we already knew, who is being sent to the works because of what happens in Old Iron, one book earlier. Nice bit of continuity there. I said Old Faithful is the same episode as Gallant Old Engine, but I think this is a better version. My least favourite is Sir Handel, and my favourite is Old Faithful. Number 17. Henry and the Express by Christopher, with the stories Henry's Hero, Overhaul, The Smelly Kipper, and Tickled Pink, by which I mean Out of Puff, Overhaul, Sliding Scales, and Henry Sees Red. Definitely one of Christopher's strongest books, that plays on the Henry James pairing really well. I say my least favourite story is Sliding Scales, and my favourite is Henry Sees Red. Number 16. Percy the Small Engine by Wilbert, with stories Percy and the Signal, Duck Takes Charge, Percy and Harold, and Percy's Promise. This is where we start to enter the truly amazing category. All 4 stories are incredible. If I had to pick a least favourite, it would be Percy and the Signal as the most boring one, and my favourite is Percy's Promise. Number 15. Gordon the High-Speed Engine by Christopher, with the stories High Speed Gordon, Smokescreen, Fire Escape, and Gordon Proves Point. Chris wrote so many stories about fire and fireboxes that they all kinda merge into one, but they are some of his better stories, so I can't really criticise him for it. All 4 stories are great. The first is a lot of fun, and the final is triumphant. This book is really well structured, with the first 2 stories having Gordon messing up that puts him in big trouble with the Fat Controller, the third see him struggle through when everything is stacked against him, and the final has him winning the battle and proving his worth. I'd say my least favourite is Smokescreen, and my favourite is Fire Escape. Number 14. Small Railway Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Ballast, Tit for Tat, Mike's Whistle, and Useful Railway. This is a very neat book. The small railway is introduced via Duck and Ballast, and then each of the 3 characters gets a story focused on them, and they're all great stories. My least favourite is probably Ballast, as it's just an introduction rather than an actual story, and my favourite is Useful Railway. Number 13. Really Useful Engines by Christopher, with the stories Stop Thief, Mind That Bike, Fish, and Triple Header. Definitely Chris's best book. Like with Toby Trucks and Trouble, I prefer the ones that weren't adapted for TV. It's also one of Chris's better books in terms of structure, with the first 3 stories being about Thomas, Percy and Duck, and the final story being them together. My least favourite is Mind That Bike, and my favourite is Triple Header. Number 12. The Three Railway Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Edward Stay Out, Edward and Gordon, The Sad Story of Henry, and Edward, Gordon and Henry. In my original top 10 video, I had this at number 8, and while this has moved down in the rankings, it's still incredible. All 4 stories are great. I'd say my least favourite is Edward Stay Out, and my favourite is Edward, Gordon and Henry. Number 11. Oliver the Western Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Donald Stuck, Resource and Sagacity, Toad Stands By, and Bulgy. 4 more great stories, with Bulgy being a childhood favourite and Toad Stands By being a current favourite. I'd say my least favourite is Donald Stuck, and my favourite is Toad Stands By. Number 10. Mountain Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Mountain Engine, Bad Lookout, Danger Points, and Devil's Back. The only book to feature the Mountain Railway, and it's a great one. The railway is again introduced via characters we already know, this time the narrow gauge engines. If I had any criticism, it's that it takes half the book to get to the Mountain Railway, but that's the only thing. If I had to give a least favourite, it would probably be Mountain Engine, as that's more of an introduction than an actual story, and my favourite is Devil's Back. Number 9. Stepney the Bluebell Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Bluebells of England, Stepney Special, Trains Play, and Bowled Out. Another 4 great stories, which features the best title of a story in the whole Thomas franchise with Trains Play. My least favourite story is probably Bluebells of England, as, again, that's more of an introduction, and my favourite is Bowled Out. Number 8. Edward the Blue Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Cows, Bertie's Chase, Save from Scrap, and Old Iron. In terms of the 4 individual stories, this should probably be lower down, but none of the stories are bad, and they come together to form a great book, and as it focuses on Edward, it goes up considerably. My least favourite is probably Cows, and my favourite is Old Iron. Number 7. Gordon the Big Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Off the Rails, Leaves, Down the Mine, and Pink Pots and Queens. Gordon always got the best stories when it came to the railway series and most eras of the show. All 4 stories are amazing, with Off the Rails and Down the Mine definitely being the standouts. I'd say my least favourite is Leaves, and my favourite is Off the Rails. Number 6. Henry the Green Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Cole, The Flying Kipper, Gordon's Whistle, Percy in the Trousers, and Henry's Knees. The one criticism with this book is Percy in the Trousers. This book is 5 stories long, one more than in every other, and they add in a random story about Percy that barely features Henry and doesn't advance the character arc in any way. Other than that though, the other 4 stories are all amazing. My least favourite is Percy in the Trousers, and my favourite is probably The Flying Kipper, but it could have been any of the others. Number 5. Duke the Lost Engine by Wilbert, with the stories Grandpuff, Bulldog, You Can't Win, and Sleeping Beauty. I think I had this at 9 in my original video, and I criminally underrated it. The first 3 stories are some of the best you will ever find, with only Sleeping Beauty even somewhat bringing it down, but it wraps up the book brilliantly. My least favourite is Sleeping Beauty, and my favourite is Bulldog. Number 4. Troublesome Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Henry and the Elephant, Tenders and Turntables, Trouble in the Shed, and Percy Runs Away. This book was a childhood favourite of mine, and remains near the top with 4 amazing stories. The plot of the engines carrying out a strike is such a good one. I'd say my least favourite story is Henry and the Elephant, and my favourite is Percy Runs Away. Number 3. Mainline Engines by Wilbert, with the stories The Diesel, Buzz Buzz, Wrong Road, and Edward's Exploit. A very strong book that introduces fan favourites of Bill, Ben, and Boko. The Diesel and Buzz Buzz are both a lot of fun, Wrong Road is a childhood favourite, and Edward's Exploit is the best story in all of Thomas, and one of the most universally loved. The Railway series story is so much better than the TV episode, due to the extent of the damage done to Edward. Overall, I'd say my least favourite is Buzz Buzz, and my favourite is Edward's Exploit. Number 2. The 8 Famous Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Percy Takes a Plunge, Gordon Goes Foreign, Doubleheader, and the Fat Controller's Engines. Another 4 very strong stories, with both Gordon Goes Foreign and the Fat Controller's Engines being childhood favourites, and Doubleheader again uses a Toby James dynamic. As a kid, I loved the London Underground, and one of the reasons I loved Gordon Goes Foreign was that it mentions 3 underground stations. Admittedly, they're talking about the mainline stations of the story, but I didn't think too much about that back then. My least favourite is probably Percy Takes the Plunge, and my favourite is Gordon Goes Foreign. And number 1, Enterprising Engines by Wilbert, with the stories Tenders for Henry, Super Rescue, Escape, and Little Western. This is the book the vast majority of people will say when asked what their favourite book is, with all 4 stories being absolutely incredible. Tenders for Henry is a very solid start, and it brings real-life events into the Railway series by officially referencing the end of steam. Super Rescue is Henry's last big story in Wilbert's book, and it's a fantastic way to end his arc from his origins as a failed experiment that was the result of stolen plans, who was nearly sent away by Topham, to a very capable, strong and triumphant engine who is able to rescue 2 diesels and their trains, while having failed himself. Super Rescue is one of, if not the most universally loved stories of the Railway series, and Escape is another one that is right up there. While we were told about the scrapping of steam engines in past books like Edward the Blue Engine, the Twin Engines and STEPNEY the Bluebell Engine, as well as earlier in this book, this full-on shows an engine who is trying to escape scrap, and is one of the most epic stories in the franchise. And Little Western, while not exactly being a story in itself, wraps up everything beautifully, with Oliver joining the Ducks Branch Line and Bear getting his name and joining the railway. If I had to pick a least favourite, it would probably be Little Western, as it's more of a wrap-up than an actual story, and my favourite is Super Rescue. So there is my rankings of the 42 Railway series books. As I've said many times throughout this video, a lot of this is subjective. I am very well aware that I have placed a lot of books down in the bottom 10 that a lot of people will have near the top, and there's nothing wrong with that. Also, since most books are really good, opinions on the exact ranking will change over time. So if I make this video again next week, it would probably be slightly different. So please don't take this as my definitive ranking of the books for the rest of time. But that's the end of the video. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment down below what your ranking is. But that's all for today. I will see you next time.